You're going to make sure of that, no? Yeah, we can do it? Okay, Hamid? Thank you so much, Hamid. Thank you for all the good work. Welcome back again. Welcome to the third Urgency Intensive, the continuation, the third day, and the last part of today, which is the assembly. So every year we have the assembly and we gather together to talk about the issues at hand. The Urgency Intensive sets out to think about the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change as sort of a boundary object and to insert art within the equation under the title of the Intergovernmental Panel on Art and Climate Change. Next to that, we are imagining sort of the fourth working group. How would the fourth working group look like if we would insert the arts within the assessment, ways of assessment? There's three reports that have sort of the physical science basis. Second report with the impacts and adaptation and vulnerability. And the third report is about mitigation. And then there is the synthesis report, which will be out in February. February, April, okay, yeah, not precise. So I would like to introduce Jeff Diamanti, who we have asked and given the task to moderate this gathering, this assembly. Jeff is an assistant professor of environmental humanities at the University of Amsterdam. His first book, Climate and Capital in the Age of Petroleum, was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. And he is also co-director of the Field Arts Residency in Amsterdam and the ongoing At the Moraine research project in Greenland with Amanda Butskes. I'm giving you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Hicham. And Bruno and everybody who has put together this incredible event. I'm going to speak slowly as my PowerPoint loads and I get the clicker. Thank you. Yeah. I want to say, first of all, that it's an enormous privilege to be even part of, in any way, part of this event, let alone facilitating this final conversation. I've learned so much in the past couple of days. I've been inspired. I've had my own habits of thought shifted. And I want to start this conversation with a provocation. I'm really hoping that my PowerPoint works. Thank you. That's the middle. Can we go to the beginning? Thank you. The provocation is a question about what would happen if we took really seriously the invitation of this event, right? What would it mean to actually develop a fourth working group? Why wouldn't we do such a thing? Is there a way in which the arts are already sedimented centrally into the assessment reports, into the assumptions of the models, into the communication technologies and techniques that the IPCC has long relied on? If you took a look at the most recent report to come out, what was it, 8 months ago or so, you might have noticed that beside the link to the download was a 13-minute video, a sort of short documentary giving you the top points of the assessment report, but also flooding you with images, lots of images. You might imagine what those images would look like: polar bears, frogs, ice, dry sand, these kinds of things, right? There's an image economy obviously baked into climate discourse that the IPCC is alert to. And so in that way, we might say that the arts are already sedimented into the imaginary, the climate imaginary. But I take this occasion as an opportunity to think seriously about what other ways, perhaps more disruptively, the arts might be integrated into the assumptions, storytelling modes, visual economies, sonic economies of the IPCC. And so I've been listening very closely for the past couple of days and trying to think about how our many contributors have already kind of addressed versions of this question. And I want to start with something that Paulina said yesterday. I'm not sure if Paulina is here with us right now, but Paulina was giving this really incredible presentation about the work that she's been doing in Sami territory in Finland. And at a certain point, she said something kind of funny. She said, Teresa and I leaned into one another and laughed when she said this. She said, I don't really know what the arts is, and I'm not really sure how I'm an artist or how any of this counts as art, but I get resources from arts funding agencies to protect land. And in the middle of that anecdote about not really caring about the status of art necessarily, she offered this wonderful formulation about what the arts can do. She said that as a consequence of this advocacy work that she's doing as an artist, she was able to draw a relatively or nominally obscure and minor river into significance. In other words, endow the river with a kind of signification through storying, right? And as a consequence, it took on a different significance at the national level, right? People care about it, think about it, it speaks. It is given a forum to think and be in conversation with. Right, so there's a really minor example, but a beautiful example of the kind of thing that would be really difficult for an IPCC assessment report to think with. Here's a bunch more. These are all quotes from the last 2 days. These are paraphrases, mostly, of things for what for me were the crux of all of the presentations so far. I'm not sure where to stand exactly, so everybody can see everything, but as you can see, there's a thread, a thematic that runs through many of these concepts or arguments. There's a thread about time. There's a kind of set of arguments about tempering how temporality is understood by the UN. There's a claim about historicity of the present. There's a claim about the historicity of the present. What conditions got us to the present, which is a kind of question of causation that the assessment reports don't necessarily need to take into account, but are implicit in their scenarios, right? There's a question of what kinds of histories are erased, obscured, or repressed as we start to think about things like climate justice, right? So I'm going to come back to these at the end because they feed into what I've collected from the participants, which are a number of questions that they sort of pose to each other about the role of the arts. And I think here we have the beginning of some answers, and I want to truncate them at the end and give you sort of two clusters of questions that I see these feeding into. Okay. I want to make a quick claim, very quick, because I know we're already a bit over time. I want to claim that the IPCC is participating in what we might have called 30, 40 years ago meta-history. Those of you who have taken a literature class maybe at one point or a theory class probably know that we are in the wake of meta-narratives, but the UN assessment reports in some ways have turned the future into a kind of object of inquiry in very much the same way that in the 19th century history was understood as an object of inquiry. The flip, though, of the past into the future as the thing that concerns us, that needs explaining, that needs an orientation towards, I think is really interesting. Now, these might not seem like meta-historical claims in the scenarios that we just heard these wonderful presentations about a moment ago, but in some ways they are, right? They distill an enormous amount of complexity and potentiality into a set of factors that are forced into models, right? And as we know, the models are not real, but they are orientation devices, and I think anybody who works with models knows that and says that, right? But those assumptions, of course, are also plot lines. They're ideas about how a plot is moving us into a future and what kinds of plots or pathways we might prefer and disavow, right? So we're talking about, and so here very literally we have, in these scenarios from the last assessment report, we have stories of sustainability, the middle road, regional rivalry, and so on. And as we just saw in this previous presentation, there are actual stories imagined in each of those pathways, right? Now, they're not particularly riveting stories, but they are stories, they're orientation devices, right? And in some ways, they tell longer stories about how we got here, what kind of thing the human is, what this planet is as a space, what the limits are to growth, what growth is, what it might be, and so on. These are meta-historical claims about where we're going. Now, the concept of meta-history, if I can get the next slide maybe, mine's not working. Originally comes from the literary theorist and historian Hayden White in a book called Meta-History. I won't read all this out to you, but the point that he makes in this book is that actually in the 19th century, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, when you have something now like a legible concept of the social brought into focus for historians, and a sense of modernity on the tip of everybody's tongues, right? His claim is that you have a new way of writing about the past. And those new modes of writing about the past have ideological implications for how we politicize the future. And he says that in each of these four modes of telling the story of the past in order to orient towards the future, right, that they all begin with what he calls a kind of prefiguration of the historical field. I think about the historical field in a similar way to how a model condenses an enormous amount of complexity that is not necessarily pre-organized for you, right? All of the stuff, the detritus, the potentialities, the dreams, the symbols of history have to be brought into relation somehow. And Hayden White says when you bring it into relation, you do so through figurative language, right? So there are key or signal figurative phrases in each of these four modes of telling history, or telling the story of history, that insinuate an orientation towards the future. Not working again, right? And more importantly, insinuate a narrative structure that has different actors, causes, losers, winners, and so on, right? So he claims that there's really there's four tropes of figurative language that prefigure the historical field: metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. I'm going to speed through this a little bit quickly, but what I want us to focus on is synecdoche and irony. Now, can we go to the next slide? For a second, I forgot that I wasn't actually teaching a class right now. I was about to ask if anybody knows what synecdoche means. I'm sure you've encountered these terms before, but all they are ways of describing relations between things, right? So a metaphor is an assembling of a relation between two objects that don't necessarily bear resemblance. And the metaphor itself brings them into relation, right? Metonymy is the use of something associated with a thing to stand in for it. Think about the phrase, something like the crown instead of the king, right? The crown stands in for an entire apparatus or institution. Synecdoche is using the part of something to represent the whole, right? It's again a form of figurative language. Think about nice wheels, right? The wheels stand in for the car, or what's another example of a synecdoche? I can always only come up with one. We encounter them all the time, right? And the point that Hayden White makes about synecdoche is that as a figurative form of language, it integrates all manner of difference into a singular quality. So there's a qualitative organizing principle that brings all of this stuff into relation in this mode of telling history. Now, I've been thinking about this with students for a number of years, what narrative structure the IPCC writes its voice into, right? And we're kind of stuck between metonymy and synecdoche. But the argument about synecdoche would be important insofar as this signal phrase, anthropogenic climate change, takes a single part of the larger planetary history and story, anthropos, and designates it as the locus of future making. And that makes good sense, obviously. The very concept of climate change names the human as the primary actor, but also potentially the biggest loser in the story, right? So that's a form of synecdoche. The human stands in as the arbiter of futures, planetary futures. And the whole point of the IPCC assessment reports, I think, is to clarify or focalize what version of story we might be finding ourselves in. Is it a comedy? Or is it a tragedy? If it was a metonymy, we were thinking about tragedy. And my students can't figure this out, neither can I, because we keep getting stuck on the concept of a tipping point. Because the concept of a tipping point is a kind of terrifying recognition, I think, if you're a climate scientist. All it means is, beyond that point, we don't know. There are cascading, amplifying effects that can't be modeled. Right? It betrays the reason of the model. It's terrifying, it's tragic. If it's comedic, it's because we know the story that we're in and we keep repeating it, right? Okay. Now, so we're stuck. Are we in a tragedy or are we in a comedy? Not sure. Are we in an irony? This is the last point I want to make before I start to round out and introduce our next speakers. Now, Hayden White designates irony, and we might think of irony as a kind of, a way of not taking something seriously, but that's actually not what it means at all, technically. And we just actually saw two examples of irony. In a moment, I'll say more about that. He says that irony as a figural mode, right, doesn't integrate or reduce it actually negates the relationship between two things in order to see something that might be more true about that relation, right? So the mode, instead of a metaphor or something, is what he calls, and literary theorists call, catachresis. And catachresis is basically a messy metaphor, a metaphor between two things that doesn't quite make sense, right? Or something like a non sequitur. In poetry, it simply means a thought after a line break that doesn't in any necessary way follow from what came before it, a non sequitur, right? Or in the first keynote of this event by Bio, we heard a lot about errancy, an errant voice, and opaque relations that can't be reduced or stabilized by what he called the ontological stabilization of climate data, right? These are forms of catachresis. They negate the fixed point. They don't fix objects down to properties. They allow things to float around, to rub up against each other, and to flip around. The point about irony for Hayden White is that it's a way of figuring non-figuration, right? So it's in other words, a way of acknowledging a relation and then thinking about what is in that relation that can't be represented. Now, I want you to think back to the list of kind of key claims that have been tabled during this program, right? The claims about the deep history of the present, the claims that Bio made about data, the history of data being the history of colonialism. These kinds of deep structural relations that can't be represented or figured. These are all forms of catachresis. All right. Now, why might catachresis matter? I'll speed along and give you a quick example. We just saw it. This was a beautiful illustration of the political force of irony, right? Why might this matter? At this point, you might be thinking, well, it's not the 19th century anymore. Who cares how historians in the 19th century told the story of the past? I want to say that there's actually an enormous amount at stake in how we tell the story of the present. There are a lot of political conflicts, histories, and violences that simply don't have space to register in the way that we're currently telling the story about the pathways into the future. And one of my favorite critics, environmental critics, Catherine Youssef, in a book called A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, I wonder if it's possible to move the text over a little bit. I can't quite see it all here. She claims that this term, the Anthropocene, basically embeds an entire history of slavery, of plantation economies, of exploitation, of dehumanization, of deep structural racism. It effaces that history in its language of a geological grammar of the human. The geological grammar of the human, she simply means this signal phrase by Crutzen, right, that in the Anthropocene we witness the becoming geological of the human. It's a way of designating agency in the measure that the human has access to geological resources, right? So in this book, she basically goes back and she puts herself in conversation with an entirely different set of interlocutors than you would see cited in an assessment report. And I want to put some pressure on this and say that there's an epistemic politics of citation at work in her book. And I want us to think about maybe that as one of many possible inroads into how the arts might be thought as a disruptive force in the existing working groups, right? The politics of citation. Who are you citing? What does the world look like from within that citational politics or that bibliography, right? Okay. All of this, I've been sort of talking about the politics of historiography, and I've been trying to think about how historiographical reason is actually embedded in the futures thinking of the IPCC, right? That the future becomes an object of historical inquiry, an object around which you can organize and act. And this is a claim that the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty made quite a while ago now in 2008 in this sort of famous article, one of the most cited articles in the humanities. I would love to see it cited in an IPCC assessment report called The Climate of History, 4 Theses, where he basically says the way that we tell the story of the human, basically as a triumphal story of progressive freedoms, right? We can't tell that story anymore because those freedoms are premised on an enormous amount of petrochemicals, right? Of hydrocarbons, of resources that got us to this point but will not get us much further. So the very structure, the story, the narrative structure of history has to change, he says. So what is the historical field of the future as it has come into focus in this program? That's what I want to ask questions about and invite interlocutors to think about we've already had a number of answers to this question. Here they are again. Anti-carbon democracy. I think TJ's here with us. He offered this wonderful phrase, anti-carbon democracy. We've been thinking about the inscription in Sophie's wonderful presentation, about inscription as an ecological responsibility, about thinking about the human as a thing that inscribes and is inscribed into at the level of the lithic composition of your bones and your teeth, but also the landscapes on Earth where a daily life draws and literally draws into the landscape through remote mining and things like this, right? What is the historical field of the future? 500 years of contradiction. This was Selçuk's wonderful formulation, right? That can't be figured in an assessment report. Or disobedience as an engine of historical growth. There's not a lot of disobedience in the scenarios in an IPCC report. And for good reason, right? It would be interesting. I mean, I think it would be funny. This would be one way of sort of ironizing the narrative structure of an IPCC assessment report to think about what a revolutionary pathway would look like. If suddenly the workers, as TJ was asking us to think about yesterday, rose up and seized the means of production. Why don't you write about that? I'm just kidding. Of course not. It would be deeply disruptive to the coherence of the document. But that's part of the point. So, finally, here are 4 questions that were sent to the organizers from the participants. There are a number of others, but I've collated them into a thematic cluster. One is about how we think about and figure and relate to various and contestable temporalities. How are the arts drawing different and nested temporalities into focus in the present? And the second is about orientation. I believe, Julian, you were talking about orientations in the last presentation, and the force of language, and the power and politics of a lexicon, right? The kinds of words you use, and so on. So these are both direct citations from the questions sent to me. And so once we are reassembled in about 25 minutes as a roundtable, I want to invite reflection on these questions. And I might pick on people who sent them to me if you don't speak up. In the meantime, I'm so excited to introduce our final panel, as it were, before we turn to the assembly. We're incredibly lucky and privileged to be joined by 2 IPCC vice chairs, who you can see on the screen over here. First, I'll start with neither of whom I've met, so it's really lovely to meet you. Welcome to Maastricht, from wherever you're coming from. First is Professor Youba Sokona, who, with over 40 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development in Africa, has been at the heart of numerous national and continental initiatives. He's currently a vice chair of the IPCC after serving as co-chair of Working Group 3, following being a lead author since 1990. He has a proven track record of organizational leadership and management, for example, as inaugural coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center, and as executive secretary of the Sahara and the Sahel Observatory. Professor Sokona is a global figure with deep technical knowledge, extensive policy experience, and an unreserved personal commitment to African-led development. Before I turn the floor over, because I'm actually not sure who will speak first, let me introduce our second speaker, or first, as it may be, Professor Thelma Krug, who was elected vice chair of the IPCC in October 2015 for the 6th assessment cycle, after having been co-chair of the IPCC Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories from 2002 until 2015. She's a former researcher at the Earth Observation Coordination at the National Institute for Space Research in Brazil under the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovation, and Communication. And for more than 15 years, she represented Brazil in negotiations at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with particular focus on issues related to land use change and forestry, research and systematic observations, and reporting guidelines. And her main areas of interest are climate change and the role of deforestation, forest degradation and land use change, REDD+, I don't know what that is, I can't wait to learn, and national greenhouse gas inventories. Please join me in welcoming our 2 guests.
Yes, hello, should I start?
Yes, Thelma.
Okay,
please.
that's fantastic. So good afternoon to all, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here once again and build on the previous discussions we had as the sixth assessment report is coming now to an end and giving origin to another cycle next year. So maybe who knows if a revolutionary scenario will pop in. It depends very much on the literature that is assessed and the evidence. So I thank the Academy for the invitation to participate today with my good friend and Vice Chair Youba Sokona, and I appreciate the continuous efforts to explore how arts, social sciences, and humanities can interface with science to inform policies and global politics. So the IPCC has a fundamental role to ensure this interface through the assessment of literature from all over the world and on all issues related to climate change that ranges from observations of the climate system and that helps understand the changes in the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, the terrestrial biosphere, to assessing observed impacts and also future risks of climate change globally and regionally, including how the world can respond to these challenges through adaptation and mitigation efforts that have very close linkages with cultural values, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, all of which are fundamentally important to avoid maladaptation and respect the cultural heritage. So this is why the development of any report from the IPCC is supported by a very careful process that aims to reflect the range of scientific, technical, and socio-economic expertise, and also to strike a good balance in terms of gender, geographic representation, and participation of experts from developing and developing countries, as well as countries with economies in transition. So this ensures that the reports from the IPCC are not biased towards the perspective of any one region, and that questions of importance to particular groups are not overlooked. So increasingly, the work of IPCC enlarges the spectrum of disciplines in its work, from physical sciences to life and social sciences, including assessment of scientific research in health, urbanization, transport, energy and economics, and many more. So it is well known that across sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected. So the knowledge that the vulnerability of ecosystems and people to climate change differs substantially among and within regions, driven by patterns of intersecting socio-economic development, unsustainable ocean and land use, inequity, marginalization, requires that IPCC includes in the assessment not only topics such as cultural values and culture, ethics, indigenous knowledge, behavior, historical experiences, traditional practices, but also the required institutional, financial, and governance structures that enhance resilience to climate change and enable adaptation in settlements, in cities, and key infrastructure, highlighting the regional differences around the world. So these highlight the importance of the diversity of authors that voluntarily engage their time in the work of the IPCC and bring the regional perspectives that can facilitate decision-making, which is strongly linked to social, cultural dynamics and social processes. And my question is, what is the value of a wealth of scientific findings and conclusions if it cannot be communicated in a clear and understandable way to all that can trigger inclusive decision-making processes and inclusive planning initiatives that are informed by cultural values, cultural heritage, and traditional knowledge to support the resilience of communities to respond to climate change impacts, including extreme events and natural disasters? How can the barriers and socioeconomic conditions be addressed through national and international initiatives so as to ensure a world of reduced inequalities and less exposure to the threats of climate change? So communicating science so as to reach all levels of society and trigger change, stimulate adequate and regionally acceptable political responses, and stress the roles of culture and heritage in transformative change and alternatives for sustainable futures. This is also a form of art that needs to be continuously perfected to reach everyone's heart. Art in all its forms, culture and heritage are windows in millennia of human experience that can be instrumental in helping shape our strategies to adapt and to make communities more resilient to climate change risks and challenges. And IPCC is continuously improving the art of communication, not only through the key strong messages, but also through improved visual representation of its assessment. So with this, I pass it on to Youba Sokona, my nice friend, that will provide also additional information. Youba.
Thank you, Thelma. Thank you. And it's an honor, a great privilege for me to be a part of this conversation again in a terrain that is I'm not familiar with. I will just want to highlight some elements in order to kick off, and then we can have a conversation on how we can benefit from the art and how art can support the work of IPCC. As you already know, we at IPCC are about to complete the sixth assessment report, the sixth cycle of our assessment. Despite the difficult circumstances we were all experiences with the COVID pandemic, and we have been innovative and then learn from art how and then to continue working despite the fact that not being present. It was challenging. And then we all thought in the beginning that we may not be able to complete our report because we cannot have a physical meetings, but we succeeded to complete it. And between August 2021 and April 2022, the IPCC has released 3 assessment reports produced by its 3 working groups. The first working group on the physical science basis, and then the second working group on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, and then the third working group on mitigation of climate change. The reports are clear, and they all indicate and reinforce that climate change is caused by human activities, and it's affecting the weather in every region of the world. And emissions of greenhouse gas like carbon dioxide or methane from human activities are warming up the atmosphere and changing our weather and climate. I don't need to go to any detail, and I know that in the morning you had some detail from Detlef and others. We made a presentation on that. And climate change also is increasing the frequency and intensity of heat waves, heavy rainfall, and flood and drought. And in the past, we were a bit hesitant and then to attribute the extreme event to climate change. And from the latest report, many evidence indicate that those extreme events are related to climate. And this is projected also to continue and get worse over the coming decades. And then the more we wait, the more difficult we'll face, and then the amplification and then the number of extreme events will be very important. You know, in the region I'm coming from, in the Sahel, people are experiencing within a few months flooding and extreme heats at the same time, the combination of those different extreme events. Rainfall and river discharge have become more variable, impacting sectors from farming to hydropower, with losses and damages to household, communities, livelihood, and economy. And then many of the poor developing countries, all the gain they have made on development front has been swept up by the climate and the extreme events. Sea level rise is already impacting ecosystems, and there is no way of turning back to initial situations. Human livelihood, infrastructure, food security, ultimately it threatens the existence of cities and settlement in low-lying area and some island nations and their cultural heritage. There is no time to lose. Measure would involve rapid and deep emission cuts in emissions, along with ambitious adaptation action. Every fraction of global warming increasing the risk. The time for action is now. And I think that it's very important that you come in because we all need to join our forces and then to act as soon as possible. And acting will require, I think, three fundamental critical elements all together in a continuous basis. Educate at various levels in different forms. Inform all the people using different means, ways, opportunities, and awareness raising at various levels. You just indicated my hotel room, and there is a very nice, table, a painting, and then this can be done to educate people and then to act on climate issues. And we'll come to that later on. Let me pass to Thelma. Thelma, back to you.
Activating my audio again, Youba. Thank you very much, Youba. So, yeah, we know that people who are socially, economically, culturally, politically, institutionally, or otherwise marginalized in society, these are people that are especially vulnerable to climate change and also to some adaptation and mitigation responses. So this heightened vulnerability is rarely due to a single cause. So rather, it's the product of intersecting social processes that result in inequalities in socioeconomic status and income, as well as in exposure. So such social processes include, for instance, discrimination on the basis of gender, of class, race, age, and disabilities. So understanding these differential capacities and opportunities of individuals, households, and communities requires knowledge of these intersecting social drivers, which may be context specific and clustered in diverse ways. So field studies really depict the full spectrum of these intersecting social processes and the ways in which they shape multidimensional vulnerability to climate change. And this is the value that I see from the Academy's initiative, which is really to highlight the role of these culture and cultural practices, cultural differences that frame the importance and value of the impacts of change, shape the feasibility and acceptability of adaptation options, and provide the skills and practices that enable adaptation. So when I finalized my first remark, I really mentioned the art of communication. And I think it's important to highlight how IPCC has been changing and trying to reach, as I mentioned, the hearts of people. And one of the most strong messages that IPCC provided, I guess, through its lifetime of 33 years, was from the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we saw everybody repeating it. It was everywhere, which was, the 3 bullet points, as I say, that says that every warming matters, every action matters, and every year matters. And this has really, really made a great impact on how people started to become aware that dealing with climate change was not something that was only related to governmental actions, but everybody has a role in helping to deal with the threat of climate change. And that every single increment of warming increases the risks and the impacts of climate change, in reaching the most vulnerable. Another more recent, I guess, communication of the IPCC is that without the rapid and deep emission reductions in greenhouse gas reductions, 2 degrees Celsius limit of warming might be without reach. So those are the kind of communications that are really sharp, really very simple, and don't go into the complexities of trying to make everybody understand what is behind climate change. But these messages are really important. So I see, and again, I reinforce the important role of the Academy in bringing these issues and facilitating communications through art and respecting cultures and the cultural heritage. So with this, thank you very much. Youba?
Thank you, Thelma. I think what else to add, and I would just like to stress here that IPCC assessment reports increasingly acknowledge the need for climate science to explore and tap into all areas and form of knowledge. And sometimes we have some difficulties to do so, but as we have been imaginative to do so, because how to bring on board the indigenous knowledge, the local knowledge, which is not captured in the literature. And there is some ways, and then we manage to do so. It's very important. And this is a critical component if we as IPCC are to present comprehensive and balanced assessment of the causes, impact, and more importantly, the response options to climate change, being adaptation or mitigation. Ultimately, this is what we need to provide. The IPCC already collaborates with artistic and creative community in various ways, and we can do more. We already have philosophers as authors in our report, and we hope through your work and the work of others, we would encourage even more interest in the future as IPCC report cover all disciplines. Did you know that the cover pages of some of our latest report, are inspired by art? And at the same time, this art is inspired by our report. Just look at the 1.5 report cover. Look at the Working Group 2 report. Look at Working Group 1 report. All those are inspired and are inspired also artists. The artworks inspired by science are many, and they have been the power to engage a broader audience, and by drawing in those with whom traditional scientific graphics, such as charts, bars, curves, polygons, figures, and storytelling do not connect. We will continue to participate in festivals, museum initiatives, and youth activities dedicated to art, and to encourage art organizations to become IPCC observer, as this open up ways for cooperation. And I am in Bamako and Dakar. Last week, I had some interaction with some of the musicians, the singers, and then to integrate climate change in their music, and then so that a wider audience can have more information on what to do and how to do. And climate change is not static, and it doesn't wait. And there is a huge importance of independent actors, and then to become part of the growing climate action in many countries. I think that we need to act now. The time is not about the issue of tragedy or comedy. The time is now how to turn all that on hope, and this is very important. How we can tell the story of hope, and then for a well-being of all the people dealing with the climate change at the same time. It's possible, it's doable, but it's very hard. And then it is not easy to tackle it. But together, we can win. Thank you. Thelma.
Okay, Youba. No, I think that you mentioned it all. The time for action is now, Youba. And as you really mentioned, this is not an easy thing. So it needs everybody engaged into the efforts of conveying the messages of the IPCC in a simple way, through art, through the respect to the indigenous practices. You were very well mentioned, in IPCC, in this assessment report, in particular in this cycle, has really reinforced the role of engagement of all sectors and all people, be it in the civil society, be it in the private sector, governments at all levels. So it talks about inclusive governance. So nobody's out of this, of this equation, as I used to say, as a mathematician. So the equation has many variables, and every single person has a role into resolving the equation. So, Youba, with that, as I already mentioned, I see a critical role of the academy into joining the efforts to convey to the best way possible the messages of the IPCC. Not only that, but through this working group, fictitious working group, I would say, it is also a way to try to stimulate people to write, people to have articles that help IPCC to assess. And because it's only through publications that IPCC can continuously improve, bring more evidence, and bring more agreement among the literature all over the world. So it's the only way that we can respect all these cultural differences, all the different cultural aspects that make climate change a big challenge to be, to recognize all this heterogeneous world that we live in. So with that, back to you, Youba. And I think, I don't know, I think our time is due.
So back to the organizers, and we'll be ready to open the conversation.
Thank you so much. Can we give them a round of applause? So Thelma and Youba, that was incredibly rich, and there's a lot to think about and unpack. I want to just say, just draw out three things really, really quickly before we turn it over to our roundtable participants, who I'm sure also have a lot of thoughts and questions following that. The first is, Thelma, you opened with a joke, and I thought it was really funny, which is that having a pathway that plots out revolutionary action depends on the evidence. That's hilarious. But I wonder what kind of reading practice a working group looking or able to acknowledge that evidence would what the reading practice would look like. Jokes aside, two very serious things I want to just keep on the table, because I feel like they change how I think, at least a little bit, about some of these questions. The first is this notion that that vulnerability of the marginalized, addressing vulnerability of the marginalized is a fundamental component of climate mitigation, not a secondary one. I want to take that really, really seriously, and I wonder if you might say more about that in our conversation, but also what some of the panelists think about that notion of addressing marginalization as a fundamental component of mitigation, what that would look like. And then the third thing, just really quickly, is so both of you spoke quite extensively about the degree to which the IPCC as an organization has invited or internalized communications experts into the work that you do. And I think you can see that from, hello, kitty cat. You can see that across the arc of the reports, and also the ways, as you say, the report on 1.5 degrees, which I took as a watershed moment in the arc of the IPCC, insofar as it included Pacific Island nations. It acknowledged some of the pressure from unrepresented groups in the UN, and shifted the story a little bit. So that's one way that we could see the arts being included as a working group, obviously, improving the communications capacity of the IPCC. And that's a powerful one. I take that really seriously. I wonder what other ways we might imagine, though, a collaborative and serious and porous and generous relationship between the different disciplines in the IPCC. So with that, I want to first invite some of the panelists to maybe reflect on some of the comments we just heard, if you have immediate questions or comments. And in the meantime, I wonder if we might get the PowerPoint back up, if that's possible. I'm not sure if it's going to be possible. If it is, there was 4 questions that I had posed. If it's not possible, it's totally fine, because now we have lots of faces in the room. Hello, everybody else. Welcome. Actually, we have one more face, but I believe there are more. So let me just stop for a second and see if there are any follow-up questions or comments based on that presentation from the panelists. And then as you're gathering your thoughts, I'll just say I think we have roughly an hour for this segment, maybe a little bit less. We'll take a quick break after that, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A as well as online questions. But if there are burning questions online now, send them to Bruno, because I can see Bruno sitting there waiting for your questions. Any follow-up from the participants?
If I may.
Please.
I think that the problem is not really how to increase and to improve the assessment. Their problem is how to get to action at individual level, at local level, at community level, at national level, at a global level. And we need to have a bottom-up approach of the problem. It is not really to assess. And I think that those are where art can be instrumental, because as the art is everywhere, and everyone is looking at art in different form, different view, different culture. And then it's the best way of educating to change our behavior. And I think that those are some of the elements I really think that how it might be possible, the complex scientific findings, it could be possible to translate in a communication vehicle for people to get in concrete action, say at individual levels.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think many of us would agree. I wonder if I can invite either TJ, if he is on the Zoom, or Selçuk to respond, but I do see that there's a follow-up or an additional comment first. Go ahead. Oh, yeah. Thelma, go ahead.
Yeah, tell me just when, yeah, I just want to follow up. But if there is someone before me, it's perfect.
No, please.
Oh, okay. No, I just wanted to react to the revolutionary scenario. Okay, maybe I didn't quite understand possibly what you mentioned on that, but let's see. How are these scenarios built in terms of the IPCC? So the IPCC makes this assessment on the how the drivers of anthropogenic change can be included in, can build into the future, can evolve in the future. So that includes a change in global population, technology advances. It also includes mitigation, adaptation. So it includes a wealth of elements that might give an idea on how the future will evolve. So today, as you mentioned in your presentation, IPCC worked with these 5 scenarios that allows us to project how these future, these drivers could influence the climate change in the future warming, ranging from the very, very low emission scenarios to low to the very high emission scenarios that drives us into a world where an average temperature increase would be around 4.4 degrees, the best estimate at the end of this century. So, so maybe I didn't quite capture the revolutionary. It gives a range of possible futures. A range, as Youba says, it all depends on action now, because we know the implications of these future scenarios. So what else could we include in terms of scenarios if we are already having an ambitious scenario that will potentially lead us at the end of the century to limiting warming to 1.4 degrees Celsius at the best estimate, not that we cannot have an overshoot in between, to the worst scenario, I would say, that would lead us to a very unsustainable world. So that was the comment that I wanted to make. With regard to your second question, in terms of the most vulnerable people, obviously, it is a challenge of climate change, right? When we think about the most vulnerable people that are the ones that have the least contributed to the situation we have presently are the ones most affected, and the ones that have the least condition also to adapt to climate change. So when we talk about climate change, cities, infrastructure, when we talk about developing countries where, thousands and millions of people do not have the basic services like, drinking water, safe water, that do not have sanitation, at best, even in the case of Brazil. I think that, we have a huge amount of people without adequate sanitation and drinking water, house assistance, and so on. So the IPCC thinks, of this global transformation. And that is what is challenging, because we are not talking something that would go smooth, but it would be a transformation where we can potentially include adaptation, mitigation in what the IPCC calls a resilient, a development resilient to climate change. And that is what it really includes, all this mitigation, adaptation that are not easy. Youba has stressed that point very clearly. But more than that, it points out you know, how are we going to do this? Because this is in terms of knowledge, in terms of evidence, we have plenty. But how do we cope with this? And IPCC really puts a lot of, makes it very clear that, you know, international cooperation, partnerships have an incredible influence on how we could go and move into a different world. But obviously, you know, as I said, this is not easy, including the challenge that we have presently. We know with all the new conditions that the world is living, that COVID first, war now, that not necessarily puts climate change, you know, as a priority, and in particular how countries could support each other to help, you know, move into this climate resilient world.
Thank you so much for that. So at this point, there's a question or a comment, rather, a follow-up from TJ online. So maybe he can get queued up. And then I think there's a follow-up by Detlef. And then I would like to just emphasize, out of respect for everybody in the room, that we treat the following stage of the conversation as a kind of open assembly conversation. And I will, I'll draw on some of you if you don't volunteer yourself. So TJ, go ahead. I think on the point of action.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the presentations of Thelma, Krug, and Youba, Sokona. One thing that I found hasn't really been emphasized enough, though, especially in relationship to the proposition that the arts be placed in the role of communicating science, is the functioning of power, and also the way in which the work of the IPCC can sometimes come up against the contradictions of fossil capitalist governance. And this happened, for instance, when it came to the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 3 in the IPCC's AR6 report on mitigation, when a large section of the summary for policymakers ended up being edited and rewritten by governments in consultation with corporate lobbyists. So that whereas the scientists had recommended things like eliminating all coal-fired plants worldwide this decade, that ended up being transformed in the final text because of government interventions, so that there was the claim that the number of coal-fired plants could be increased due to the promise of carbon capture and sequestration. So this is a really critical example of how the arts ultimately are, risk their real dangerous role if it comes to merely communicating science, when science is already enmeshed within the power politics of fossil capitalist governance. And so I want to avoid reducing the arts to something that is merely illustrative or acritical, and add in the importance of thinking about arts in relation to politics, criticality, and intervention, so that it's not simply ultimately a matter of communicating science, even though that has to also be taken into account, but also looking critically at the process and exposing the kind of power plays that can happen, that can really interfere with the science, in order to think about an altogether different role for the arts, which is more of an active and critical stakeholder in negotiating the world we want, and not letting it fall into the grasp of the normative politics of fossil capitalism and all of their vested interests. So I think this is really crucial. I would like to talk more about and hear more about the role of arts in relationship to politics, in terms of building a large-scale social movement that is empowered to bring about political transformation, so that we're not faced with this continuation of the total destructive role of dominant governance within the scientific process. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ. So I think on that point, perhaps, Detlef might want to continue, and then I'm going to invite Teresa and Selçuk to maybe follow up on the invitation to think about social movements.
Yes. I was originally coming on also on a different point, and we'll do that as well. One important element of the IPCC process, the report is completely written by scientists, but the summary for policymakers is approved by the governments. And I think it's actually a very important element of that report, because that means that all countries in the end can't hide. So they have accepted the summary of policymakers, and therefore in the negotiations this has become a fact. That is a process that is difficult because many countries have an interest, but in that establishment of the SPM, the countries have a voice, but also the scientists. And there's nothing in the SPM in the end which is not also accepted by the scientists. Just to make clear, it does mean sometimes indeed that some part of the report in that negotiation process are taken out, for instance, in the SPM. But I can assure that actually for coal, there is no ambiguity at all. The SPM is still very, very clear about the reduction of the need of coal. The difficulty, of course, with coal is that especially in developing countries, much more than in developed countries. On the scenario process, and I think the relationship with arts is partly on the communication, and I think that is a great addition to the process, and I think we need to use it more and more. Obviously, art can also play first the scenarios. Because Thelma was responding on the scenarios, but I think there are two ways that scenarios play a role in the IPCC process. One is in working group 1, where scenarios are mostly a description of emissions, of CO2, about land use, and therefore the most important thing is that they need to cover a very wide range from very low to very high. In working group 3, and also in working group 2, the scenarios are also about transformation. And then it's also about different roads. It's about whether we go for renewables or for lifestyle change and there, obviously, you would like to democratize that process, scenario making more. And what we have done in the past, there are two routes for scenarios to go into the IPCC process. One is the route of the people that were behind the SSPs, including myself, where we organized at some point a meeting with 60 people, scientists, to create the scenarios. Then we put all that information out for comments. We invited people to comment, but to be honest, the comments that we got was from scientists. Because we probably, I can't remember anymore, but I guess that we communicate mostly to scientists that we created this. And so it would be good if we try to do that in a better way next time and communicate wider. But the second route for scenarios actually to enter the IPCC process is that everybody that publishes something in the scientific literature also needs to be assessed. And so in addition to the scenarios that we created, you see that we do discuss, for instance, degrowth scenarios or lifestyle change scenarios, because we need to do so. And that's that second route. It is a not so easy route, maybe for the non-scientists. Because there is an additional rule within IPCC that we mostly need to cite literature from the scientific literature. The reason behind that is a good one, because the original idea is that literature is peer-reviewed, and above all, it's also accessible for everybody. But we know that knowledge is also available in the non-scientific literature. So there are processes to get that also into the IPCC process. And that we call that the gray literature, but it is slightly more a higher obstacle for gray literature to come in than white literature, and maybe that also is something that at some point needs to be thought about. And then I like the idea of the fourth working group. I think it's a nice provocation. Also, I think it's really indicating how important things could be of the official routes to get into and maybe influence the work of the other three working groups. In addition to publishing, there is a consultation round that IPCC does. It consults in its process at some point NGOs. It consults businesses, you could think potentially that there are also other groups that IPCC could include in some of these consultation routes. The official route, in terms of the authors, so far, most of the authors are recruited from science. We have been experimenting also with having authors from other groups, including businesses, including NGOs, into the process. That is not always easy, because while scientists, at least to some degree, have an obligation to be as neutral and as objective as possible. If you are an NGO writer in the process, or a business writer in the process, obviously you have also a background that is looking at your action, and so that is a process that we are trying to find out how to do that best.
Thank you for that. I have a lot to follow up on, but I've already taken up too much time. But perhaps on the notion of the democratization of the scenarios, and as a follow-up to TJ's provocation about social movements, I'll hand the mic over. Perfect.
Whew. Hard task to follow up on those. I don't know, I have some fragments that I've been collecting these 2 days I'd like to share, and perhaps they will contribute. I have like 2 paradoxes that have been bothering me these days. One is that it feels like we've never been so politicized, like every gesture, every act, everything we eat, every breath we take is politicized. This is not me.
Somebody's mic perhaps online is on. If everybody can just mute.
What was I saying? That we've never been so politicized, and yet we've never been so disorganized, right? We have this gap between the level of awareness and action. The other being, and that's based on the science that we have, we've never knew so much about the future, and yet we've never felt so powerless to intervene in it. So again, maybe more knowledge doesn't necessarily turn into more action, right? But as Bio reminded us first day, perhaps poetry can, perhaps words can, maybe language can. So what I would like to suggest is a very tentative offering that I am really open to being challenged on that. So what an IPACC can contribute, artists and cultural workers can contribute, is by monitoring, reporting, modeling, assessing, synthesizing, call it whatever you want, the uses of language, the uses of metaphors, or all those. I'm definitely not a literary student as Jeff is, so I wouldn't know. But so that we can shape, like we can have a better awareness on the uses of language, the shape of our language, the limits of our imagination, the blind spots of our thought processes. And that doesn't require a 4th working group. That can be already part of every working group. That can be part of every UN process. And for that, I want to kind of share a few maybe anecdotes that have been bothering me about the uses of language in climate politics at large. Let's start by the halls of power. Remember how in COP21 that tiny change of wording from shall to should have basically reshaped the entire climate politics of the Paris Agreement. So shall being more determining what should be done, so it implies a binding imperative, whereas should is just a recommendation. And everything from US participation to the Paris Agreement to reparations, financial reparations, depended on such a wording. And so my question is, should words have such a power in the first place? Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe we shouldn't put that much weight in them. The second is in the use of language in science, and especially when we are describing these bad scenarios. Other cultures have called these apocalypse, gave it many names. We are giving some initials and codes to unspeakable horrors. and we flatten them on graphs and models, and I am really appreciative of the efforts to indeed give depth and meaning to these. And the third is in maybe social sciences. We also had that yesterday with TJ Demos proposing the distinctions between degrowth and eco-socialism, and we talk of post-capitalism and decolonization. We have an inflation of words to describe our preferred futures. Do we need more of them, or do we need less of them? Again, provocation. I'm fine with either way. And finally, the language of movements, and that is where my most maybe pride and also ambivalence lies. This term that has really moved me for more than a decade, climate justice, the term that was obscure and inexistent indeed a bit more than a decade ago. It's maybe too much to call it a household concept, but it is somewhere I wouldn't have imagined 10 years ago. And yet, like, I can't claim victory in this because it is too slow, too little, and we all know that with climate, winning slowly is the same as losing. So the question is, how do we make this even concept sovereign? When do we get ministries of just transition, ministries of climate justice? How did these words enter those halls of power? So just to conclude, all power to the imagination, as the 68 movements would say. So that maybe with that the use of language, we can bridge these gaps between the words and the actions, and then maybe that revolutionary scenario can be crafted not in the literature but in the movements.
But it needs to be citable, Selçuk.
Okay.
So sorry. Okay. Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering, first of all, if there's immediate follow-ups from anybody in the room. Okay. Otherwise, actually, I was going to pick on you and Hamali, because Hamali and David actually contributed really a number of really beautiful questions about language, about the use of language. One of which I had on the PowerPoint earlier. So, if it's okay, can I just read it quickly, because it's really wonderful.
Absolutely.
And it follows up directly on, I think, what Selçuk is asking us to think about. So, they say Western capital-attuned language uses the monetary language of extraction or exchange to describe our relationship with the natural world. It divides and separates the human from the non-human. We go to, quote, spend time in nature. We, quote, pay our respects to the weather gods. We, quote, invest in energy. We, quote, conquer summits, traverse shores, and so on. And here's the question: how do we realign our lexicon, create a different grammar for the way we live in, with, and also against, in some cases, nature, that allows us to reframe ourselves as part of its body, both a source of nourishment and a wild force that can wreak havoc on our lives?
Perhaps I'll let Himali talk to this, since she's the poet between the two of us.
Hi, everyone. It's so inspiring to be here right now. One of the follow-up quotes that we put in that question was thinking about how Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about indigenous language as allowing for the natural world to be far more alive and sentient. So in her language, you don't say obey, but you say to be obey. And I was thinking earlier while you were speaking about synecdoche and metaphor, also that in Hindi, for example, nadi is a river, but nadi also actually means a blood vessel. So the river is a body. Now, how do we think about that in climate change? I think we've had a lot of shifts of language. We began with global warming, then we called it climate change. I'm working with a big museum right now that has masses of visitors, and they're not allowing me to use the word Anthropocene because it's not in the vernacular. So what should be in the vernacular? And who decides that? And I feel like the recent language shifts that we've had, Extinction Rebellion, a climate emergency, are languages that trigger us. They are words that we push against because they inspire fear and alarm in us. So what's the word? Thelma earlier says, if temperature actually increases by that 4 degrees, then we're creating an unsustainable world. But the phrase an unsustainable world is passive voice. Unsustainable world for who? The earth may still sustain. So how do we rephrase that the earth is going to become unsustainable to us, that it is dying? And maybe just thinking about TJ's comment as well, is like, how do we retain the politics in that language, but allow it to be alive and give ontology back to where we came from, and that is the earth itself.
Molly, thank you so much for that contribution. I feel like I almost want to just let us sit with that for a second. But I did want to invite David as well, because as Molly was speaking about vernaculars and the ways that within certain kinds of lexicons and grammatical structures and linguistic traditions, the logical standing of what in English we would call nouns, insinuates a radically different cosmology, worldview, and sense of the real, admits a sense of the real and gives access to a sense of the real that is actually quite difficult within English. You offered us two really very literally moving performances yesterday, which allowed for the resonances in this room and the room downstairs and the frequencies to actually move through our bodies. And in that way, you were also working on a kind of deep vernacular, right? And drawing us into relation. And it gets to another question that you and Hamali posed about ceremony.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of link that back perhaps to your opening question about what is the role of art in the IPACC or IPCC process, or the potential role, perhaps transcending the role as being a mere tool of communication. And I would perhaps like to start by challenging Youba and Thelma's presentation, which posited that we actually... Okay, is this better? Okay, sorry. I wanted to start by challenging Youba and Thelma's positing of there being enough knowledge and there being solutions that we just have to communicate them, and that's a role the arts could play. And I think clearly we don't have enough knowledge and we don't have the solutions, because if then the implementation is part of it, and this is where we're clearly failing. And I think this points at the entanglement, which we've talked about a lot during the last few days, and the entanglement of the political, the aesthetic, the spiritual, all these different dimensions, and that if we only operated in one field, in this case, perhaps the scientific, we will not be able to reach or to implement even those purely scientific solutions. There's a limit. And I think this is sort of the opening through which I wanna think about the arts in this process. And in lots of the presentations we had over the last few days, we talked about orders or systems of order or paradigms, and how these need to be deconstructed or shifted. I'm thinking about different points of orientation here. We talked about capital, TJ's presentation, but also Selçuk and Teresa's work a bit, how to interrupt, how to reorganize that. We talked about the scientific paradigm actually earlier on this afternoon, and we talked about it in I guess, a vaster sense, a more fundamental sense almost during Bayo's presentation. And this, connecting this back to the question of what role can art play and how can art contribute to a solution, is that let us think about the kind of other semiotic, ontological, and sensorial processes that are at work with this really entangled problem, which is not only a scientific problem and therefore not only has a scientific answer, and where art can insert itself into these cracks and operate on different levels, not only as a messenger, but perhaps as a different experience of being in the world and a different experience of what, well, climate change is. But I think it goes much deeper. This is perhaps one expression we reduce things to, right? Which we reduce it to that kind of scientific thing that has all these other implications. But we could also start at a different point and say, well, what's the breakdown? And actually, we don't have to have a breakdown. We don't have to have a hierarchy. To solve it, we really have to operate on all levels simultaneously.
In eco-semiotics, I love that contribution. I also want us to sit with that for a moment. I feel like there's so much to process in this conversation. I want to maybe just really quickly, before I invite another interlocutor into the conversation online, Taru, if you're there and ready, I'm going to read the question that you posed in a moment. But I wanted to just maybe, I'm enthralled to be part of this conversation. I want to make sure that everybody recognizes that the criticality that TJ is asking us to sort of introduce into this conversation also recognizes how much respect I feel in this room for everybody's various viewpoints and the enormous amount of work that other people behind these contributions have done. And I'm thinking in particular about I know that the work that goes into the construction of the assessment reports is tireless, thankless, unpaid for the most part. I learned that recently from my friend Joyita Gupta. And I think that's, you know, I think what we're doing here, what I feel like we're doing is taking it very seriously, not being dismissive of the work and the discourse of the IPCC report and the working groups. So Taru, you posed a question that sort of follows on the heels of this actually, which is, you asked how can the arts challenge productivist and deterministic logics of progressive linear time in response to climate emergency? And that question really resonated with me because of simply the sort of the visual translation in the scenarios, the way that the scenarios translate time into a linear progression, and by design to be effectively communicative, but also it would be difficult to imagine a kind of warped or tidal time or non-progressive time in those scenarios. So can I ask you to elaborate on what you had in mind with this question?
I'll do my best. Thank you again for everybody, and it's wonderful to continue in this conversation. I have to say that I also have so many thoughts kind of all muddled up in my head. It's been extremely inspiring last 2 days. So, but I'll try to say something kind of semi-sensible at least while I process a lot of things. First of all, maybe I'll get to time and question of time, but I'd like to maybe certain thoughts just came up in following the last hour's conversation. One point is maybe to kind of re-ground us somehow and to thinking of having worked with scientists and artists in a very kind of specific location, looking at studying environmental changes that are happening in a very specific marine environment for the last few years, and working with scientists who worked there for generations. There's a lot of questions about time that come into this that are very specific to a specific context. And so to kind of, I guess the kind of one problem is also when we are abstracting. After all, when the IPCC reports and all the research that it's founded on is very, very specific. These are kind of studies that are very specific and located and situated. And it's really about the kind of synthesis of bringing this together that give us a kind of bigger planetary picture. But I think it's also important to kind of go back and go back to think of also where the arts contribution could come in. It's also, arts are already involved, very much so, on the ground in different places, in different ecosystems and communities, collaborating with scientists across the globe, collaborating with other forms of knowledge and knowledge keepers, and also kind of working actively in exactly kind of trying to get to the action that this knowledge and the evidence that we have is already, you know, kind of in a way challenging and pushing us towards finding. I think the arts are active in looking for those ways of actually getting to action and thinking of those very specific local conditions and think of how to work here and how to get people involved here. And this is, for example, what Pauliina has been doing in her work. You know, she's been working with her Sami community for 20 years. And this is basically a kind of very grounded work where now she's managed to get involved a huge number of the local community, but also different sciences to work together. And I think the kind of what kind of comes out of this, her work, for example, that she was talking about yesterday, is really clearly this, that the arts can do something that maybe nobody else can do. Like she said that, okay, this could not, what she's been doing could not be done by any other discipline somehow than the arts. So if, you know, it's something that has to be done. Nobody seems to be able to do it within their framework of kind of profession or within the kind of structures that allow for them to operate. So we can do that. If we can do it as artists, this is what we do. And I think this is kind of this is one sort of example of this, how arts are already in complex ways actually part of this work. Maybe they're not cited or kind of referred to in the reports as much as they could be, but maybe in the future there will be more. But then question of time kind of relates to this. First of all, I think the arts are as much slaves to this kind of productivist, linear, progressive temporality and logic, and also kind of drivers of that in many ways. So it is also for us to kind of think, how do we kind of step out of this, this kind of constant sense of having to produce new, being kind of tied to this sort of project funding logic and so on that pushes us to produce in a kind of, and build careers and so on. So there's a kind of question of how do we start working against that. But also one way that again, kind of Pauliina's work, for example, give us an example of how working within the Sami communities, the Sami artists are always posing this question that it's not just about the future. You know, we need to repair past damage. How do we actually attend to and start working from the past damage, the damage already done, rather than thinking about the future kind of catastrophe to come. And so this already kind of requires a different temporal kind of direction somehow, that we actually start from restoring and repairing. And so what would be an art? What would be kind of art of repair and restoration? Can the arts, you know, actually take their role as in action of actually being the kind of working with repair, finding ways of, you know, to repair and restore. And of course, again, another question is of this kind of complex temporalities is the working with field scientists who study the environmental changes. They are very aware of the kind of complex temporalities that are involved in any ecosystem. And so when it's a seasonality, it's different kinds of cycles, it's different kinds of ways that are that you cannot study a specific phenomena without actually being very attentive to very different kind of temporalities that are actually all interconnected, and also often very cyclical. And so this already also kind of requires a different sense of being able to return. How, you know, that there is a constant return and kind of rethinking and working with those sort of cycles and different temporalities actually out there in the environment itself, that somehow totally doesn't follow this linear, homogeneous temporal logic. And so this is also a challenge to artists, because then you start working with phenomena out there and you realize, okay, you have to come back, you know, because it's like, first of all, there's a seasonal cycle, there's a different kinds of layers. And in a way, it requires you to start working cross-generationally, maybe, like the scientists would do, actually studying a kind of long-term environmental change. And so these are kind of, how can we kind of imagine the arts somehow working in those ways as well? Some of these are the kind of my immediate thoughts. I hope this made some sense.
Oh, it made a lot of sense, Tara, thank you. And it's also a riveting set of sentiments and ideas and arguments. I really like this notion of the arts of repair. I think that was an idea that Paulina was also speaking to yesterday implicitly. So thank you for making that explicit. There's a lot to unpack from what you just said, but I was thinking that one of the questions that Lisette, Julian, and Katarina posed, they posted 3, all of which I think are worth taking up. But I actually want to start with a question that they posed, which is related to these distinctions that Taru was just making, but at the level of, they provocatively utilize a kind of bureaucratic language, I think, to draw into focus complex temporalities for us. So they say, would the IPACC have similar aims as the IPCC to identify policy relevant but not policy prescriptive insights? So first I want to ask if one of you 3 could distinguish those 2 for us. And then you follow up with 2 sub-questions. The first is, could the arts and humanities realistically avoid policy prescriptiveness? So let's parse that. And does transformative potential of creative practices lie in informing policymakers, or perhaps something else? Do you want to elaborate on these questions?
Yeah, so is this on? I think so. Thanks. Yeah, this is much better. Thanks. So you asked me to clarify what is policy relevant, policy prescriptive. I think this is kind of the mantra of the IPCC, giving like different options, but not defining which options governments should take, but the options that are lying out there. So being relevant to policymakers, but not being prescribing what they need to do. But of course, this line is, in practice, quite a gray area sometimes, because there's choices being made in what options you lay on the table, which might not be all kind of the ways we can deal with the climate crisis. And as Tata was saying, it's not like it's a whole negotiation that is ongoing with the governments. So it's not like a neutral way of representing what things are on the table, but because sometimes just things are cutting out of the SPM, for instance. So I think that's one thing. So I was the reason I posed these questions was because I was wondering the rules of the IPCC and how it works is quite restrictive. And I was wondering, let's say we have this kind of speculative working group 4, maybe it has to have different rules. As Selçuk was saying, maybe it could be some form of assessment, but it might not, have the same role of being in peer-reviewed literature or something like that, or what was said earlier, I think the arts can have a real valuable contribution of actually identifying ways of mitigation and adaptation. I don't think all these solutions are out there and we just need to take action. Actually, I think we are missing loads of that. And what you were saying as well, what is missing is also, okay, so we need to think differently of what identifies us. If it's not our consumption that identifies us, what is it that is identifying us, which also arts can bring. So just a few thoughts. Maybe you can add something. You have some thoughts as well.
I was just thinking, as what you said, the rules and protocols of IPCC kind of limit the criticality to some extent, because there has to be so many rounds of consensus and so on. So to me, it also sounds that if we want to bring arts in, and I would really agree with TJ's point here, like it shouldn't fall into this instrumental box of illustrating. And then IPCC says we're scientists, we're neutral. Yet then where are the politics? So if art can't do that, if IPCC itself doesn't do that, and then politicians are just trying to protect status quo as much as possible. So what is happening and where? So I almost see that IPACC could be this place where we kind of conceptualize things about where we're going and who we are and what we want to happen to us, to new generations and so on, and be more philosophical. But I also see it almost like as a kind of disruptive force, questioning the ways things are done right now. Yeah.
Thank you. I think probably on a resonant point, TJ has a contribution to make. Can you hear us, TJ?
Hey, thanks everyone. Sorry to take this back a little bit, but I wanted to address this proposal of the arts of repair, and think a little bit more with that, which is a really important proposal for art's contribution to building new and other kinds of worlds, including through ecosystem restoration or remediation practices, care work, building, constructing repaired environments. And I just want to add to that, while I think all that's important, I think it's also important to avoid focusing on that without taking into account the larger ongoing destructiveness of the dominant economic system and how it's continuing to commit all forms of acts of socio-environmental violence. So while we talk about the arts of repair, what does it mean to do that when the ongoing causality for environmental violence continues? So this gets to the point ultimately of how else can we intervene in a way that can be scaled up to stop the causality. I think this is like an ongoing urgent point, and this is this is what I'm trying to address in my work, is thinking about how we can create networked forms of organizing and transnational activities, so that we can back up some of the more, I think, crucial, important insights of science that meet the deadlock of fossil capitalist governance that ends up shutting down any proposal that doesn't prioritize economic growth and market-based mechanisms or techno fixes. And I think that this is the real practical problem that organizations like the IPCC face when it comes to how to implement the scientific insights in relationship to governmental policy. Because when governments are beholden to corporations, to capitalist organizations, to international trade relations, and all of that, when, for instance, Putin can make a decision to invade Ukraine, and it throws the entire commitments of Europe to carbon reduction into utter chaos, and returns us all to thinking more about returning to fossil energy systems. What does that mean? I think we have to discuss how we can intervene, not simply in terms of scientific insights or the arts of repair, but how can we intervene in these political processes that's creating a world that seems to be dedicated to mutually assured destruction.
So an arts of repair that's matched with perhaps an arts of dismantling. Taru, did you want to follow up with one last point before we take a quick break?
Yeah, just a little bit to continue to maybe clarify. Also and thanks TJ for your really fantastic talk yesterday. We had a long conversation with Pauline after that, and also talked about how actually her work, this long-term work in SubMe has actually, what it has produced, there's been a very concrete restoration work happening, which has actually been very much about involving the local community into actually also kind of finding themselves as a community around within this particular environment. And so it's actually really kind of actively involves a kind of a number of people. But alongside this, there's also, she has been working with all these different scientists from also, who've actually collected a lot of data that has basically now produced documents, material, peer-reviewed articles that are now witness material for the local community who are able to actually go to court and show with kind of scientific evidence of how actually the forest management in that area by the state of Finland has actually violated their rights as indigenous community. And so it has really worked on that different levels. So now they've become actually active in restoring and taking kind of taking control of this area in a way that they just didn't have the tools before. And this has actually come out of an artist work. Artist as a kind of mediator and facilitator and initiator of this work that has brought all of these different people together. And so I think this is kind of one model of kind of very small scale, but actually has potentially grows into a really huge impact. And it can be also kind of something that if this was happening in many local contexts at the same time, this will obviously has a massive force of change already potentially. Thanks.
So there's two, I think, immediate follow-up comments before we take a break. I'll ask them both to be pretty quick. First Teresa and then Youba, and then we'll leave for 10 minutes. Oh yeah,
ready.
Go ahead.
No, I wanted to throw one more thing in the table that actually connects with the criticality that TG Demos is asking for and your comments about what is missing or the knowledges on the solutions, because I think the solutions are there and there's nothing missing, but it's not represented. I think Thelma mentioned the unrepresented in the process of the IPCC, and I am asking maybe for an art of unrepresentation and to bring all those that are unrepresented in this conversation and to the account, to the consideration. I mean, historically, the future that we're talking about is premised on the past that have been destroyed and decimated for more than 500 years. And we have to be very aware of that. And even the IPCC mentioned colonialism as a cause of climate change. So that's a very radical statement. And yeah, keep it short. Arts of unrepresentation.
I would love to come back to that after the break. Youba, you had a comment?
Because I have to leave, I'm in between two flights. I want to clarify some point regarding the IPCC, how it's working. Because there is no government can write the report of IPCC. I think that Detlef responded to that. It's an intergovernmental panel. It is not an independent panel. You have to understand that. The government are in the beginning for the scoping. They are also in the process for commenting, and then they are also in the approval. And then they comment. The last word is the authors. If the author disagree, will not accept anything that is, there is no single sentence in the SPM the author do not agree. And there's nothing that is not traceable to the literature that has been captured in the main report. I want to make that clearer too. And then regarding the, the participation, and then the area also of the domain of expertise that has been widened. If you look at from the first assessment to the sixth assessment report, things have changed drastically. And then we still need to improve. And I did not say that there is no new knowledge that is needed. I said that we have enough knowledge. We have enough science to act. We do not have to wait till we have the paper. And then even the conclusion of the fourth assessment report. Let us take the case of many African countries. They are building their energy system. Why they have to go to fossil when we know that it's possible to do renewable? It is not a problem of lack of resources. And if you go to the IPCC Working Group 3 assessment on the finance, we do have enough resources. And then in order to invest and to fund and then to redirect money to the low or zero carbon options. And then a wide range of options exists in the report. We can invest on that. And this is only what I said we need to do. And there is no possibility of any other part to come and to create a fourth working group. But what is possible is to have a third party if it's not publication. How we incorporate the indigenous knowledge in the IPCC. Because we could not do it, it's not captured in the literature. What we did, we had an agreement with United Nations University. We organized a number of seminars, number of workshops and different things. On adaptation, it was in Mexico. On mitigation, it was in Australia with them. And then United Nations University captured in a publication. And this is how it has been brought in. And then also they are part of the review process. And then we make sure that they review the document and so that we can capture. There are different ways of doing it. IPCC has a specific mandate, and then they can operate under those mandates. And IPCC never be involved in the implementation of anything. It's just to provide the science to the government, to give to them different options, up to the government to decide. But we encourage many others to have third-party projects from the IPCC findings. And this is why I said that there is many ways, and then to bring the artists in, not only the artists all over the world, and then to communicate the some of the complex elements that is in the captured in the IPCC report. Those are some of the clarification I just want to put on the table, because many people talk about IPCC, but they do not know how IPCC is operating. It's very transparent, it's open, and then a lot of things need to be improved at any organization, and then we are making a lot of progress, but still, I think that the emphasis is really to be able to start acting from what we already know.
Thank you, Youba. Those clarifications are really useful for us to think about, I think. I also, I imagine I'm not the only one that feels really wound up at this moment, because there's so much to think about and there's so much at stake. I wonder if you would agree. It'd be nice to take a quick 10-minute break. And then we will return. I believe I imagine there's quite a lot of interest from the online audience to contribute questions, and also people in this room who have not been part of the conversation yet. So that's what we'll come back with. Perhaps the politics of the unrepresentable, and maybe we can also return to Youba's initial claim about the politics of hope. So 10 minutes.
No, but so critique is good. Yeah, in that sense. Yeah, and they're criticizing you.
Well, I think they're also criticizing the limits.
So that was our 10-minute break, believe it or not. Round of applause for returning on time. Way to go. Thank you so much, Thelma, for agreeing to stay with us for a few extra minutes. So this last section, we have about 20 minutes to continue the conversation, but also maybe start to hazard some conclusions, since this is the second last segment of this incredible program. I want to put something on the table first as a provocation really quickly, and then invite contributions from the audience. We, in the last hour, have been talking a lot about different forms of expertise and the degree to which an institutional apparatus like the IPCC could include divergent or diverse forms of expertise, or if that's simply not its purview. And since we ended the last part of the conversation on the arts of repair and reparations and alternative and perhaps more radical ways of thinking about justice, I wonder if we could think for a moment about what kinds of expertise is missing from the admittedly already very expansive and robust discourse of the IPCC. what it simply can't take on, but what we think a climate justice movement and an IPACC type working group might draw attention to and work out. What forms of expertise are missing? You had a comment outside about very different kinds of expertise, and I think also your contribution to this conversation really got me thinking about a kind of aesthesis, an expertise on an aesthesis, the way that the subject itself is already a kind of multisensorial form of thinking and knowing, even beyond what can be translated or represented into something like a data point.
Yeah, and let me perhaps link this back a little bit to our collective practice with Hicham. Unfortunately, I had to go. And one of the questions we had given in, which was about the role of ritual and the potential contribution of some forms of art to create rituals. And rituals not only as, oh, what's a ritual, but I think we took a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer again, who said, not ritual, but ceremony in this case, is something that focuses attention and creates intention. And I think that's a very, very beautiful kind of understanding of ritual. And I'm thinking about it in this context of climate change as a connection to nature and to our planet. I think there are many, and we're talking about indigenous culture, and what comes up again and again is that connection to the land. And perhaps that's something we do not have in our contemporary societies that much. Many of the harvest festivals, many of the kind of cyclical events that remind us and kind of create this focus of intention and connection have been a little bit lost. So to come back to your question of something that art can do completely differently, but contribute potentially to towards a solution, is think about these rituals again and think about how can we ground ourselves in our relationship to our natural environments, and through that grounding change behaviors.
Yeah, that's very powerful to me. And it makes me think back to the question of citation. And I take very seriously that there's very good reason why the IPCC relies on peer-reviewed, scientifically vetted literature, right? The legitimacy of the discourse that the IPCC puts into the world will be immediately questioned and utterly useless if it didn't maintain that orientation towards the scientific, non-scientific distinction, even if that distinction has a troubled history. And yet, I think I take your point seriously that there are forms of knowing and attuning collectively and practicing forms of respect and reconciliation and reciprocity that could never find its way seamlessly into a citable scientific archive, right? And so that seems like a fundamental epistemological problem that translates very much into the reproduction or potentially reproduction of colonial difference and the disenfranchisement of certain kinds of knowledge, right? And so the question isn't necessarily how does IPCC internalize that, but how might it orient itself towards those forms of knowledge without reducing it to something like a kind of tokenism, right? Or reducing it simply to a kind of the category of the marginalized.
Yeah, so IPCC has a history from 1990, yeah? And so the question that IPCC was trying to answer in 1990 is completely different than the question that is now with us today. At that point of time, the question mostly was, is there climate change? And then next, obviously, how bad would it be? And now the main question is, how do we transform society? And with the changes of questions, the more and more it becomes important that you include other knowledge than pure scientific knowledge. And this will be a challenge for IPCC to see how it can do that. And we already discussed that there are some mechanisms within IPCC to do this. And but that is a question that's internal to IPCC, and you guys can help us with that. But I think that by itself that this fourth working group, which would not be an official one, of course, yeah, it could act simply as a teaser, as a criticism, and therefore I think the question that you asked about some of the IPCC mantras, how they would work in the fourth working group, you probably don't want them. You somehow want much more creativity in there, and which could then also help IPCC to see how some things work and maybe also respond to that. Yeah,
yeah. Well,
Hicham, go ahead, and there's a question.
Oh yeah, cool. Sorry, did I take it from? Okay. Well, I mean, I've been thinking, and then suddenly it hit me like, but this 1.5 degree scenario that at a certain point came out as a way, also as a communications device, as you were saying, and Thelma, you saw that as a great success, and it was a great success, and it is a great success. But the 1.5 degree in itself is not the complete truth in a sense, because it deals with the negative emissions, it deals with many factors in order to get to that 1.5. You could have done that differently. How could we do that differently? So there is sort of there is something there, you know, that we could sort of work on, right? I mean, that was a particular choice to choose the 1.5. Is that, am I, yeah?
So the question is to choose 1.5, or is it the route to get there? The routes I have to get there, I guess, much more. And then, in the 1.5 degree report, we had 4 different routes, which had different degrees of negative emissions. So they were actually describing that this choice is there. Yeah. In the Working Group 3 report, more than even in the 1.5 degree report, we try to emphasize the role of lifestyle change. There's a whole new chapter now devoted to lifestyle change, and even there's some discussion also on the degrowth story. And still, if I from simply the physical science side, with this 400 gigatons of CO2 left, and being at 42 now, I think there is hardly any pathway that would get you to 1.5 degrees without some form of negative emissions, and therefore trying to find out which ones do you like, which ones you don't like, and that's also for the other solutions. And therefore, we as scientists need to provide options, and so that society can decide. But for arts, also there somehow putting things on the table so society can, in the end, align itself on solutions. I think that is the role that we need to have.
But if you would take away the negative emissions, would it be then 1.2 or 1.3?
1.8 or 1.9. If you don't have negative emissions, then at some point you won't get to 1.5 degree. You will be higher.
So I think it looks like Thelma was maybe going to contribute to this conversation, and then there was a follow-up point, I think, before we go to the audience question. We can't hear you.
You muted, Thelma. Yeah. Speak somebody in the microphone.
We can't hear you at the moment. Thelma?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to try to be brief. There are so many issues, so many elements here. That I find sometimes difficult where to really intervene. I think that overall, if I want to give an overall, sense of the discussion today, I think that overall there is a lack of understanding of really the role of the IPCC as an intergovernmental agency or panel, which is to assess in a very comprehensive way, the literature, and that comprehensive, transparent. And that's the role of the IPCC, to convey the best science available, right? The 1.5 didn't come out of the blue. As a matter of fact, the special report on 1.5 was an invitation by the Climate Change Convention for the IPCC to identify the impacts of 1.5 and the pathways, emission pathways that could lead us to limit global warming to 1.5, at the end of the century. So obviously the IPCC assessed all the literature. The governments didn't even think that we would have enough, to come up with all these impacts and pathways. But there was enough to make it very clear the implications of 1.5, in particular in relation or compared to 2 degrees Celsius. The more we do in terms of going into the pathway of large reductions, right? The less we are going to have to rely on negative emissions. So that's a fact, right? So the less we do, or as we move into those pathways that have models that have been shown, the more obviously the negative emissions will play a role in terms of also the carbon dioxide removals, and also with implications and risks. So the scale, the context of the application of carbon dioxide removal is depends, has its toll. Has its toll in terms of implications. I also wanted to just very, very briefly say that, IPCC doesn't rely solely on scientists, and also seeks to feel the need, if it feels the need to have inputs from others that can contribute, including from the private sector. Obviously, there is a lot of let's say, concern of the IPCC not to have a conflict of interest that could show as a conflict of interest. But honestly, I think that the IPCC tried to be as diverse as needed to fulfill the requirements or the terms of reference that have been input into them. So also, when we have the review process is open for everyone. And this review can really complement what the authors have done at that stage. So, additional articles or additional publications can be suggested. Also, the review process is one that has to be addressed by the authors one by one. And those are open afterwards to be publicly available so that everyone will see the response of the authors to some specific suggestions or comments or feelings. So yeah, that's a very good way for that. Also, we have the observing organizations, and those are very active in the sense of coming from the civil society, very participating in the process of the IPCC. So I think that this overall, the whole process of the IPCC is not only into the domain of the scientific community, I would say. So I felt it a little bit puzzling for me, some of the comments in this respect. But anyway, I think that was basically some of the comments that I wanted to make, because I know others also want to continue to identify elements for arts to continue its work.
Thank you, Thelma. No, I think one thing I'm learning is the degree of transparency at the IPCC that maybe is underappreciated. I do actually want to just sort of emphasize, though, that I think some of the kind of criticality that we're practicing in this room isn't so much premised on disqualifying the work that the IPCC does, in as much as it is a questioning of some of the core distinctions that by nature of this group get reproduced, such as good science versus non-science. But also the kinds of imaginaries that get wired into the pathways. And as we heard earlier in the earlier presentation, right, there are specific genres of stories that are designed strategically to translate what a potential world could look like and the consequences of that world, right? But those stories come from traditions, and they're entire traditions and ways of knowing and experiences of colonial dispossessive violence that do not get represented in those stories, right? And so I think some of the pressure maybe in this room is about not so much saying that there's a reproduction of that violence in the IPCC as an apparatus, so much as it is a question of how we might balance some of these viewpoints, right? Or if indeed the IPC is simply not the space to do that, which is possibly true. So there's another comment from a panelist, and then there's two from the panelists, and then there's an audience question.
Just a very short point, and actually it's good that it's coming now at this point again, is that what I guess what I'm trying to say is not a no but it is always a yes and. So it is not, we do not need the scientific expertise or there's anything wrong with it. Quite the opposite. But I think, and talking about the mandate of the IPCC, I think the question is not what could the contribution of artists be within that mandate, but should the mandate be broadened? Should there be different forms of knowledge that operate on an equal level of contribution to the problem? Because the problem is so entangled that if we operate on a no-but basis and go single channel, I think we will never come to a solution that really includes everyone.
Yeah, no, I want to echo that. I will also. Yeah, thank you. I want to echo that, but at the same time, I want to go back to the question of what would be the role of the working group for, which is something that I'm still very confused about, I have to be honest. And I see that maybe before broadening up and bringing more elements and more expertise to the conversation, maybe we have to narrow it down and ask what the IPCC can't do because of their nature of working with governments and producing something that is reasonable for a policymaker to work on. There's a lot of that the IPCC are, your hands, I guess, this is an assumption, but your hands are tied and there's so much that you can't do. And maybe from there we can talk about the role of the working group for the artists, because we can be at the same time allies with scientists and accomplices with everything that is not represented or doesn't have a seat on the table of the IPCC. Accomplice, yeah. The difference between allyship and accomplice, do I pronounce it well? Accomplices, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And we only have about 1 minute left, but actually, on that point, I would like to invite Esme Gerken to ask a question, who is both a scientist and an artist, by degree at least.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for all the wonderful points of view, and I really appreciate how we are trying to create some porosity or permeability. And yeah, I was thinking about this fourth work group, and somehow I had this sentence in mind because of TJ's wonderful presentation yesterday, and he showed this climate justice group who had the phrase, "We are nature defending itself." And today it resonated with me that I feel in a way also science in a way is unrepresented, maybe in this discussion today, or maybe it could have a place in this fourth working group. And to me that sentence would be, we are nature trying to understand itself. And for me, what has been so wonderful about science, and I fully agree there are so many ways we need to look at the historicity of whole disciplines and the importance of rituals. So I acknowledge everything that has been said today, but I would like to add that for me, science has been all about getting lost, all about not knowing, all about the desire and the longing for understanding from within these realms you're embedded within, the climate system, the ecosystem. It's all about going beyond language, letting go of narratives to then rephrase narratives while always knowing that it's only a narrative, a model, whether it's mathematics or words or whatever language you use. And even mathematics is a way to imagine different universes with different dimensions. So that's what I wanted to add. We are nature trying to understand itself.
That could be our slogan for IPACC, or at least we could try it out, see how far it takes us. I want to suggest that we close the conversation there, unless there are final comments, burning questions. But we are a little bit over time, and we do have a final segment to look forward to. So I will turn the floor over to Hicham and Bruno to introduce that. And in the meantime, please join me one last time in thanking all of the panelists, all the contributors, and the tech team. Please, yes. A roaring applause for the tech team.
And let me thank you, Jeff. That was really wonderfully done. Thank you. You managed. Thank you. And I also want to thank Bruno for really a wonderful event. I mean, a big applause for Bruno, because super well done. And everybody of the team, and the technical team, and the participants, and all the public, and everyone online. Thank you so much, Thelma. I don't know if she's still here. Thank you, TJ. Thank you, Taru. So I would like to close this event. And as you all know, the Urgent Intensive really came about from the intention to think about the urgencies of today. And in fact, to assemble, to come together from all different stratas of life, let's say, from the public, from the artists, from the scientists, etc., etc. I do agree with you that a working group with more scientists would be wonderful, would be good to do. And also, as we speak now, there are many, many events happening at the same time. There's almost 4 events now in the Netherlands happening around these urgent issues at the same time. So that's also promising in a sense. So I'd like to close off, and because the next event is not online.
Maybe I can talk
you
about
do it.
That.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, first of all, thank you to all the speakers, both here and online, and for the commitment and energy and time. It's priceless and has been personally transformative, and I hope for the audience too. And thank you, all of you, for joining the discussion and being here for really 3 intense days. Also thank you, Bio, who might be listening to this in the recording, for the wonderful kickoff that I think set the tone for many of the other contributions. And before we close the live stream, I would like to introduce the next segment, which was how everything started. So back in March, we decided that the process leading towards these discussions, or the process of assessing what the working group 4 could be, needed a different methodology. And the methodology that we chose, also because we have an expert, a prolific dreamer in-house, was dreaming, both literally and figuratively. So since March, we've been gathering with the Jan van Eyck participants, with staff of the Jan van Eyck and the Urban Future Studio, Lisette, Julian, and Ekaterina. Well, Julian and Ekaterina are not from the Urban Future Studio, but have been entangled with it in the last 6 months, to try to collectively meet in a dream and to explore other layers of cognition that could allow us to find solutions and to come together in discussing these issues with other tools, maybe. And we would like to propose, for those who wish to stay here and to wish to stay online, it's totally optional, to join us in the final dreaming exercise that our current Jan van Eyck participant, Daniel Godinez-Nivon, will offer to you all. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that for the last 11 months, we shared this space with 35, 40 wonderful people, and they're about to leave soon. And I think this is a beautiful closure for the whole experience. So I'm referring to the Jan van Eyck participants, who are really the core of our business, and that have been fundamental to this event. And I thank you for your contributions to this and throughout the year. And they have been also prolific dreamers, as Danielle will say. But if you want to know more, you need to continue online. The live stream will finish, so if you want to join us, just log in into Zoom, For those who wish to stay, please do. Otherwise, you can go to the reception downstairs and have a good evening.